Contrary to what is claimed nowadays, psychology is far from being a new science. That is what I will show you in this documentary. Since when we humans understood ourselves as people, that is, since Homo sapiens sapiens, meaning a man who knows, the term human nature has been with us. Think, for example, of the first human who had a dream and could remember it with vivid details. Think that from this moment on, it became clear that there is another plane of consciousness, an inner life parallel to waking life, which many ancient peoples considered to be a spiritual life. Not by chance, the term psychology comes from the combination of the words psyche, which in Greek means soul or mind, and logia, which means study. But contrary to what most people think, the ancient Greeks were not the most advanced in understanding and classifying the psyche. On the other side of the world, in India, about 5,000 years ago, the Vedas were compiled. Veda means knowledge, and these books, which are four, are a kind of Hindu Bible, and within the Vedas are the Upanishads, which are the final part of the Vedas. For you to feel a bit of the depth of the Upanishads, pay attention to this passage from the Katha Upanishad, Third Valley, open quotation. Know the Atman, or self, which is seated in the chariot. The body is the chariot, the intellect, the buddhi, the charioteer, and the mind, mana, the reins, refusals. Just in this small passage, folks, we can observe a topology that considers four central elements that make up a person. Following this same line, there is an important Hindu philosopher we need to know. He calls Patanjali, author of the Yoga Sutras, who lived approximately 200 years before Christ to 400 after Christ. It's always difficult to estimate these ancient dates, isn't it? He gave the following definition to yoga. So, in this second passage of the Yoga Sutras, he says, quote, Yoga is the withdrawal of the means of expression of the mind, or chitta. The means of expression of the mind, or chitta, are called evidence, inventiveness, imagination, sleep, nidra, and memory. So, these are some of the means of expression of chitta, or psyche, observed by this yogi. Following our journey through ancient India, in classical Buddhism, we will find some important contributions to our studies, among which I will mention two. The 12 Nidanas. Nidana is a word in Sanskrit and Pali that means cause, reason, or binding tie. The first Nidana is the following. Because of ignorance, there is individuality, the illusion of self or ego. Second, Nidana. Through individuality, volitional actions, or karmic formations are conditioned. Through volitional or karmic actions, consciousness or knowledge arises, and because of knowledge, there are separate names and forms. Because of the separate name and forms, there are 6 senses. Now you watching might be thinking, hold on, wait. 6 senses, but aren't there 5? No, that's wrong. Calm down, young one. For this tradition, besides the 5 normal senses, which we are already familiar with, there is a 6th sense, which is the mind or psyche, because many things we only perceive through cognition and not through the common senses. You understand? 6th Nidana. Because of the 6 senses, there is contacto. Onde você tinha context, there is sensation. Onde você tinha sensation, there are desires. Due to desires, there is attachment. Due to attachment, there is individual existence. Due to individual existence, there is earthly existence. Due to earthly existence, there is decay and death. Second, the 4 ways of analytical knowledge. That's right. Who would have thought we could find a kind of rudimentary epistemology in Buddhism, right? Yes, they are the 4 modes of knowledge. Pay attention. First, by listening to the instructor or reading. Second, by understanding the meaning of the text. Third, through knowledge of the language. And fourth, through intuitive knowledge. Returning now to the West, after experiencing the most chaotic traffic in the world, just between us, this video already deserves a like, just because of that, right? We have two philosophers who were fundamental in the history of the sciences. I believe they need no introduction, especially here on this channel. They are Plato and Aristotle. They created theories to explain how the mind works and what causes and motivates human behavior. Plato, for example, believed that the soul, or psyche, had three parts: the intellectual part, or logos, the part that focused on wills and desires, and the emotional part. And the goal would be for the three parts to be in balance, thus ensuring a healthy psyche. Aristotle, on the other hand, added to Plato's ideas about the mind, emphasizing observation and reason as the path to acquire knowledge and understand nature. Shortly after, the Roman philosopher and physician Claudius Galen established the concept of personality type based on the theory of Humorism, the Humorism of the ancient Greeks, which sought to explain the functioning of the human body. For Carl Jung, one of the most important physicians was Galen. The use of his teachings influenced medical science and the treatment of the sick for approximately 700 years. For Galen, there are four personality temperaments. They are sanguine, phlegmatic, choleric, and melancholic. These temperaments prevailed for more or less 700 years, as we mentioned, until Scholasticism emerged and universities were created by the Catholic Church. In this context, St. Thomas Aquinas appears. St. Thomas sought to classify the virtues, emphasizing the importance of faith for the proper functioning of the mental faculties, combining the thought of Aristotle and other Gentiles with Christian revelation. Yeah, but obviously, not everyone agreed with the conclusions of these thinkers. There is always one to be contrary, right? Shortly after Aristotle stated that the soul and body are inseparable, and that contrary to Plato, the soul actually belongs to the body, a philosopher René Descartes emerges, proposing that, in reality, mind and body are separate, and that the soul is rational, and governs the machine that is this body. For Descartes, it is through the pineal gland that the soul exchanges information with the body. Are you, who is watching now, truly yourself, or are you pretending to be someone you are not? This is a question that Søren Kierkegaard would ask you. This philosopher was very concerned with a problem he called despair. He was also one of the first to emphasize the problem of anxiety, a pioneer in this. For Kierkegaard, being who one truly is actually the opposite of despair. And as Nietzsche said, have the courage to conquer yourself. Jean-Martin Charcot, the master of Freud. Known as the founder of modern neurology, the French Dr. Charcot wanted to understand the relationship between psychology and physiology. During the 1860s and 1870s, he studied hysteria, a term then used to describe extreme emotional behaviors in women, which were thought to result from problems in the uterus, hysteria in Greek. The symptoms were excessive crying or laughter, contortions and uncontrolled body movements, fainting, paralysis, seizures, and temporary blindness or deafness. Emil Kraepelin, a German doctor, seen by many as the founder of modern psychiatric medicine, believed that most mental illnesses had biological origins. In his book, Compendium of Psychiatry, from 1883, Kraepelin presented a detailed classification of mental illnesses, which included early-onset dementia, distinguishing it from senile dementias, such as Alzheimer's disease, for example. In 1893, Kraepelin described early dementia, today known as schizophrenia. Kraepelin noted that the disease, marked by mental seizures and antisocial behavior, used to manifest at the end of adolescence or early adulthood. Kraepelin's classifications are still the basis for the diagnosis of schizophrenia, even today. Wilhelm Wundt, the first psychologist. Wundt was the first to call himself a psychologist. One of the founders of modern psychology, Wundt, founded experimental psychology, establishing psychology as a science once and for all. He created the world's first formal laboratory of experimental psychology at Leipzig University in Germany in 1879. His goal was to conduct systematic research on the mind and human behavior, initially testing the most basic sensory processes. Wundt said there were two types of observation, the external and the internal, or introspection. External observation deals with the report of visible events in the external world and is useful for understanding some relationships, such as cause and effect in physical bodies. For example, in stimulus response tests, if an electric shock is applied to the nerve endings of a dead frog, the corresponding muscles contract and make the frog's legs move. The fact that this occurs with dead animals indicates that these movements do not depend on consciousness. In the case of living beings, such movements are the basis of automatic behavior that we call reflex, such as quickly pulling your hand back when touching something hot. The second type of observation from Wundt is internal, called introspection, as I mentioned, or self-observation. It involves the recognition and recording of internal events, such as thoughts and feelings, for example. It is crucial for research, as it provides data on how the mind works. Wundt was interested in the relationship between the internal and external worlds, which he did not see as mutually exclusive, but rather as interactive, describing it as a physical and psychic relationship. Pay attention, now you who are watching, if you became interested and wanted to read Wundt, be informed that there is no Brazilian translation of Wundt's main work, Principles of Physiological Psychology. And so, the complicated thing is that I even researched in English for books available here in Brazil, and didn't find any. There is one, but it's not this main work of Wundt. But anyway, Brazil, right? Fortunately. William James. He's a physician, philosopher, and psychologist. It was James who first created an experimental psychology course in the United States, even though he did not like experimental psychology, and he played a central role in consolidating psychology as a truly scientific discipline. The term consciousness is generally used to refer to the individual's perception of their own thoughts, sensations, feelings, and memories. We assume it is always present, except when we have some difficulty, such as when we try to do something in a state of extreme fatigue, for instance. But if we focus our thought on this perception, we soon notice that the experiences of our consciousness are always changing. William James compared these daily experiences of consciousness to a river that flows continuously, despite occasional interruptions and changes of direction, changes of course. The most natural metaphors to describe the phenomenon are river or stream. From now on, to refer to it, said James, we will adopt the term stream of thought or of consciousness, he declared. Attention! From this historical moment, approximately in the 20th century, things start happening more or less at the same time, so that theories begin to emerge and enter into radical conflicts, and new lines of psychology become established and communicate less and less with each other. So pay close attention so you don't get lost. Perfect? Let's continue. In this scenario, we find Alpha Bind. In 1859, Charles Darwin published his theory of evolution in his book The Origin of Species, providing the basis for debating whether intelligence was indeed fixed by genetic inheritance or if it could be modified by circumstances. In the early 1880s, his cousin, Francis Galton, conducted tests on the cognitive abilities of about 9,000 Londoners and concluded that basic intelligence was indeed determined by birth. Francis Galton had many talented relatives, among them the evolutionary biologist Charles Darwin, as we have already mentioned. It is not surprising, therefore, that Galton became interested in discovering to what extent abilities are inherited or learned. In 1869, Galton used his own family tree, as well as judges, statesmen, military officers, scientists, writers, diviners, rowers, fighters, to research hereditary traits for his book hereditary genius. As expected, he found more talented individuals in certain families than in the general population. Therefore, he could not attribute this solely to nature, since many benefits obviously arose from being raised in privileged homes. Galton himself grew up in a wealthy family, with access to exceptional educational conditions. No wonder it is said that Galton learned to read at 2 years of age. Generality or upbringing? Comment your opinion below, because I want to know. And hold on, I haven't forgotten about Alpha Bini. Look how interesting this is. Around the same time, Wilhelm Wundt suggested the idea of an intelligence coefficient, GIQ, and sketched attempts to measure it. Wundt's work served as inspiration for studies mediating mental abilities, conducted by the American psychologist James Cattell, and laid the foundation for Alfred Biné's research on human intelligence. He worked with Jean-Martin Charcot, just like Freud. His desire to study human intelligence flourished with the fascination sparked by the development of his daughters, just like Piaget. Binet noted that the speed and ease with which they absorbed new information varied according to the amount of attention they dedicated to the subject. The child's context and mental disposition seemed to be fundamental for learning. When he heard about Francis Galton's intelligence tests in London, Binet decided to conduct a large-scale study himself, aimed at assessing the differences in individual abilities among various groups of interest. At the same time, he continued to study the functional intelligence of children, noticing that certain skills were acquired at specific ages. For example, very young children were not capable of conceiving abstract thoughts. Remember this information when we talk about Piaget, okay? Around 1899, school became compulsory for all French children between 6 and 12 years old. Binet was called to develop a test capable of identifying children with possible learning disorders so they could receive education appropriate to their needs. In 1904, this work resulted in an invitation to join a government commission tasked with developing a method to assess the learning potential in children. Binet took on the primary task of establishing differences between normal and deficient children. As already mentioned, how to find a way to measure these differences. Nevertheless, we can observe that psychology was quite technical during this period and had little influence on the life of the average citizen, the one who had bills to pay. In this scenario, Sigmund Freud appears. Freud, as I mentioned in the video I made about some of his concepts, was never a psychologist. Freud was a neurologist interested in discovering whether it was possible to explain things that seemed beyond the reach of the psychology of his time. Freud's work on the subject was pioneering. He described the structure of the mind as formed by the conscious, unconscious, and preconscious. He popularized the idea of the unconscious and introduced the notion that it is the part of the mind that defines and explains the mechanisms responsible for our abilities to think and feel. Freud was introduced to the world of the unconscious in 1885 when he encountered the work of the French neurologist already known to us, Jean-Martin Charcot. That seemed to successfully treat the symptoms of mental illnesses in his patients through the use of hypnosis. Charcot considered hysteria a mental disorder caused by abnormalities in the nervous system, an idea that provided him with new and important treatment possibilities. Freud returned to Vienna eager to use this new knowledge, but struggled to find a technique that was feasible to implement. He then met Joseph Breuer, a respected doctor who discovered that it was possible to significantly reduce the severity of a patient's mental illness symptoms simply by asking her to describe her fantasies and hallucinations. The famous talking cure. Breuer started using hypnosis to facilitate the patient's access to memories of traumatic events, and after a period of 2 weekly hypnosis sessions, all the symptoms had been alleviated. Breuer concluded that the patient's symptoms were the product of memories then disturbing, hidden in her unconscious mind. Yes, and by giving voice to the thoughts, these memories were brought to consciousness, allowing the symptoms to disappear. In a way, taking these memories out of the shadow and bringing them to light. The first case of intensive psychotherapy used for the treatment of mental illness. Brouwer became a friend and colleague of Freud, and together they developed and popularized the method of psychological treatment based on the concept that many forms of mental disorders, reactive fears, anguish, hysteria, paralysis, imaginary pains, and certain types of paranoia resulted from traumatic experiences in the patient's past, and that then remained hidden from consciousness. Using a new technique that the two wrote about in a joint publication, Studies on Hysteria. In 1895, Freud and Breuer claimed to have found a way to release repressed memories from the unconscious, allowing the patient to recall the experience consciously and confront it emotionally and intellectually. The process released the trapped emotion, and the symptoms apparently disappeared. Brouwer disagreed with what he considered Freud's excessive emphasis on the sexual origins and content of neuroses, and the two parted ways. Freud continued to develop the theories and techniques of psychoanalysis. In case you want to better understand Freud's psychoanalysis, watch this video I'll leave in the card above and on the end screen, but only watch it after watching this one. Okay? Let's continue, because this story is getting more and more interesting. So, if there was an individual unconscious, as Freud said, then maybe there is a collective unconscious. Thus thought the young psychiatrist Carl Gustav Jung. Jung was born in a small Swiss village within a hidden family, which included several eccentric members. Jung was the next mother who suffered from episodes of depression. A talented linguist, he mastered various European languages, as well as numerous ancient languages, among them Sanskrit and Greek. Jung studied psychiatry, but after meeting his brother Freud in 1907, he became a psychoanalyst and Freud's natural heir. However, the two parted ways due to theoretical differences and never saw each other again. Indeed, ideas have consequences, Freud. In the years following the Second World War, Jung traveled through Africa, America, and India, studying native populations and participating in anthropological and archaeological expeditions. He became a professor at the University of Zurich in 1935, but left teaching to focus on his research. Freud was the first to take a more scientific interest, let's say, in dreams, seeking to understand the process of their formation and the mechanisms involved. And it was precisely this work by Freud, The Interpretation of Dreams, which was published in 1900, that captivated Jung. This book fascinated Jung. In fact, his theory about the collective unconscious does not arise out of nowhere. Jung had complex and symbolic dreams since the age of 3, but it was Jung's experiences with patients at a psychiatric hospital where he worked that reinforced his hypothesis. Jung observed that despite the patients, even though they were not mentally well, they still managed to draw ancient symbols, and that completely intrigued him. Jung was fascinated by the fact that different societies around the world shared striking similarities despite their enormous cultural differences. Such societies exhibited a mysterious sharing of myths and symbols for thousands of years. Jung concluded that this could only be the result of something greater than an individual's experience. The symbols, he thought, must exist as part of the human psyche itself. According to Jung, archetypes are layers of inherited memory and constitute the entirety of human experience. The Latin word archetype can be translated as the first model. Archetype is a term from Plato, and for Jung, the archetypes were memories of the experiences of our earliest ancestors, which we somehow managed to inherit, acting as molds within the psyche, like a matrix indeed. We unconsciously use archetypes to organize and understand our own experiences. Jung was also the creator of the free association method and the concepts of introversion and extroversion. In the 1990s, psychology was already established as an independent scientific discipline separate from its philosophical origins. Laboratories and university departments had been formed in Europe and the United States, and a second generation of psychologists had already emerged. In the United States, psychologists eager to establish the new discipline on an objective and scientific foundation began to react against the introspective and philosophical approach of William James and others. If psychology wanted to be included among the sciences, it had to be based on observable and measurable phenomena. The solution was to study the manifestation of mental processes, that is, behavior, under strictly controlled laboratory conditions, as described by John B. Watson. Just as psychology is the division of natural science whose subject of interest is human behavior, what is done and what is said, what has been learned and what has not. The first behaviorists, among them Edwin Guthrie and Edward Thorndike, conceived experiments to observe the behavior of animals in carefully planned situations. From these tests, they developed theories on learning, memory, conditioning, and how human beings interact with the environment. These first behaviorists were influenced by similar experiments developed by physiologists interested in physical processes, and it was a Russian physiologist, Ivan Pavlov, who inadvertently paved the way for the emerging behaviorist psychology, that is, of behavior. In his famous study of dog salivation, Pavlov described how an animal responds to a stimulus during the conditioning process, providing psychologists with the foundation to build the central concept of behaviorism. The idea of conditioning, often called stimulus-response psychology, shaped the future form of behaviorism. The behaviorist approach focuses on the strict observation of responses to external stimuli, completely ignoring mental states and processes, or even the concept of psyche, considered impossible to examine scientifically, and which, therefore, could not be included in any behavioral analysis. The shift in focus from mind to behavior in the study of psychology was revolutionary, and even came with the behaviorist manifesto, quote-unquote, the article Psychology of the Behaviorist Views, published by Watson in 1913. In the United States, which at the time led the field of psychology, behaviorism became the predominant approach for 40 consecutive years. Developing the idea of classical or Pavlovian conditioning, Watson stated that behavior is formed solely by environmental stimulus. Innate or inherited factors do not participate in the process. From the next generation, the radical behaviorist, in quotes, B.F. Skinner, was a part who proposed the reformulation of the stimulus-response concept in his theory of operant conditioning, according to which behavior was shaped by consequences and not by preceding stimuli, that is, selection by consequence. Although similar to William James's proposals, this idea radically changed the course of behaviorism, starting to consider genetic factors and explaining mental states as a result and not a cause of behavior. In the mid-20th century, however, psychologists began to question the approach. Ethology, that is, the study of animal behavior, proved that instinctive behavior was as important as learned behavior, a discovery that did not fit very well with the strict ideas of behaviorist conditioning. A reaction to Skinner's theories sparked the cognitive revolution, which once again focused attention on the mind and mental processes, moving it away from behavior. A central figure of the time was Edward Tolman, a behaviorist whose theories did not minimize the importance of perception and cognition due to his interest in the Gestalt psychology of the Germans. Advances in neuroscience explored by another behaviorist, Karl Lechley, also played a role in this shift, moving the emphasis away from behavior and prioritizing the brain and its functioning. Behaviorist thinking had reached its limit and was overtaken by various streams of cognitive psychology. His legacy, however, was quite enduring, especially regarding the establishment of a scientific method for the discipline and the provision of models that could be used in psychological experiments. Behavior therapy remains present today as an essential part of cognitive behavioral therapy. Stay tuned and attentive as we will talk about it soon.
During the first half of the 20th century, psychoanalysis in its various forms remained the main alternative to behaviorism and did not face serious challenges until the period following the Second World War. In the 1950s, Freudian psychotherapy was still being practiced, especially in France, by Jacques Lacan and his followers, but at the same time, new therapies emerged that sought to bring genuine changes to the lives of their patients. Fritz and Laura Preuss developed, together with Paul Goodman, the somewhat eclectic Gestalt therapy, while the existentialist philosophy, which we mentioned earlier, inspired psychologists like Viktor Frankl and Erich Fromm, who gave therapy a more socio-political role. The Viennese psychiatrist Viktor Frankl had begun his specialization in suicide prevention and depression treatment when in 1942 was taken to a concentration camp with his wife, brother, and parents. He was imprisoned for 3 years and experienced various horrors and losses before being freed as the sole survivor of his family. In his famous book Man's Search for Meaning, written after these experiences, Frankl explained that we have two psychological forces that allow us to endure painful, possibly devastating situations and move forward: the capacity for decision and the freedom to act. Frankl, unlike behaviorists, emphasized that we are not at the mercy of the environment or events because we determine how we will allow ourselves to be influenced by that environment. Even suffering can be seen in different ways depending on our interpretation of the facts. The interesting thing about Frankl is that he ends up fulfilling his vocation within the concentration camp. So, as already mentioned, he specializes in the treatment and prevention of suicide and depression, and it is within the concentration camp that he saved the lives of several Jews, making them not give up on life and not take their own lives, but rather give meaning to that experience and thus be able to move forward. So Frankl ends up diverging from Freud because of the experience he had in the concentration camp. He saw that it was very different. For example, the sexual factor was not such an important factor. Inside the concentration camp, it was practically non-existent. So he saw that there were, in a certain way, other drives much stronger than the sexual one, and that meaning, in a way, was a kind of cure for suffering. It's also worth highlighting a group of psychologists who, seeking to explore a more humanistic, held a series of meetings in the United States at the end of the 1950s, from which emerged the framework of an association known as the Third Force, dedicated to investigating themes such as self-realization, creativity, and individual freedom. Its founders, among them Abraham Maslow, Carl Rogers, Rollo May, they emphasized that mental health was as important as the treatment of mental disorders. Perhaps the most significant threat to psychoanalysis at that time was cognitive psychology, which criticized psychoanalysis for its lack of objective evidence regarding both its theories and its effectiveness as a treatment. In contrast, cognitive psychology produced scientifically proven theories and later therapeutic practices with clinically proven effectiveness. Cognitive psychologists rejected psychoanalysis for considering it unscientific and based on theories impossible to prove. One detail here is that psychoanalysis never really concerned itself with providing scientific evidence for its theories, so for psychoanalysis, if the treatment worked, there was no need to conduct scientific experiments to prove it. So, the cognitives went in a more scientific direction, trying to prove their theories and conducting various studies, and the psychoanalysts did not conduct studies. The fact of having more evidence in cognitive psychology means that they did more tests and proved things more scientifically, but psychoanalysis practically has no scientific research. But that does not mean it does not work, just this detail to make it quite clear to us. Cognitive psychology, on the other hand, offered evidence-based psychotherapies, such as rational emotive behavior therapy, REBT, by Albert Ellis, and Aaron Beck's cognitive therapy. Beck discovered that cognitive psychology offered a more effective therapy and was much more receptive to objective rigor. The therapy he advocated, which later incorporated aspects of behavior therapy and meditation techniques, quickly became a standard treatment for disorders such as depression and anxiety, and led to the positive psychology movement, which sought mental well-being instead of just treating mental illnesses. Freud's emphasis on child development and personal history had a great influence on developmental and social psychology. At the end of the 20th century, psychotherapists like Guy Cornu, de Virginia Sartre, and Donald Winnicott turned their attention to the family environment, while others, like Timothy Leary and Dorothy Rowley, focused more on social pressures. Although Freud's original ideas have often been questioned over the years, the evolution of Freudian psychoanalysis towards cognitive therapy and humanistic psychotherapy resulted in great advances in mental health treatment and created the model that we now call the unconscious, impulses, and behaviors. At the beginning of the 21st century, cognitive psychology continued to be the predominant approach, with significant impact on the fields of neuroscience, education, and economics. Its influence extended to the nature versus nurture debate, the classic debate, since, in light of recent discoveries in the fields of genetics and neuroscience, evolutionary psychologists like Steven Pinker and David Buss argue that our way of thinking and actions are determined by the constitution of our brain, and that, like other inherited characteristics, they are subject to the laws of natural evolution of Dorn. Social psychology emerged in the 1930s, when psychologists began investigating the interactions of individuals within groups and society as a whole. They examined the effect of social organizations on the individual and how social structures are influenced by the psychology of individuals. Social psychologists, as they were called, also studied the relationships between individuals within the same group. New topics of interest for psychology emerged from these studies, such as dynamics, group attitudes and prejudices, conflicts, conformity, obedience, and social transformation and social engineering. One of the first to conduct a systematic study of the psychology of social groups was the German-American Kurt Lewin. Considered the father of social psychology, Lewin adopted a new perspective on the dominant behaviorist approach and set out to investigate how behavior results from the interaction of the individual with the environment, as well as the nature of that environment. His studies of small groups paved the way for subsequent analysis of group dynamics and how groups and their members can implement changes. Kurt Lewin then develops his field theory, according to which behavior is determined by the life space. At the beginning of the 20th century, two main currents analyze the psychological development of human beings from childhood to adulthood. Freud's psychoanalytic theory focused on infantile psychosexual development, and behaviorism explained the mechanisms of the learning process. However, the study of development itself, including the psychological, emotional, and perceptual transformations that occur throughout a lifetime, only started to advance in the 1930s when Jean Piaget refuted traditional thinking by stating that the child is not just a miniature adult who gains knowledge as their body matures, but is also a being that undergoes extreme psychological changes during this process. Piaget raised fundamental questions such as if we acquire knowledge gradually or in different stages, if certain abilities are indeed innate or learned, and how the environment affects development, According to his cognitive development theory, the child's growth towards adult life, different stages occur, and in each of them, the child learns by doing and not by following instructions. Piaget's ideas have opened doors to a new field of developmental psychology and influence educational circles to this day. Other development theories soon came to light, even agreeing with almost all of Piaget's findings. Vygotsky emphasized that the child needed to rely on adult guidance at various stages of learning and advocated for the importance of the child's social and cultural environment. For Lev Vygotsky, a mediator was important between the world and the child. For them to truly learn what the world is, needed a mediator to explain things more deeply. Erik Erikson also started from Piaget's concepts and identified 8 stages of psychosocial development, among them the identity crisis of adolescence. Theoretical psychology tried for a long time to identify and investigate aspects of the mind and behavior that are common to all of us, but philosophers and later scientists always considered that it is the differences in psychological structures that define us as individuals. Only from the 20th century did personality become the subject of genuinely scientific study. It's not surprising that behaviorists saw personality obviously as a product of conditioning and environment, and psychoanalytic theory as the effect of past experiences on the unconscious. However, these explanations came from research related to more general theories and not specifically about personality, even after the contributions of Carl Gustav Jung in the works on psychological types in 1921 and the development of personality in 1934. The psychologist Gordon Alcorn, dissatisfied with the existing ideas about personality, wanted to thoroughly address the topic, pioneer in what is now known as Alport's trait theory, identified distinct personality traits that, according to him, presented themselves at 3 different levels, combining in a unique and dynamic manner. At each level, the notion of traits assumed a central role in personality psychology, and after Alport's study, it became a new and important area of study. Another factor that influences us as individuals is intelligence. Intelligence had been studied since the early days of psychology, but it was difficult to define, and measure. Studies on the subject are generally controversial since the time of Darwin and Galton, which we mentioned earlier, was seen as an inherited trait, a view that was sometimes accompanied by racist and eugenic stereotypes with no influence from the environment. The classic nature versus nurture debate in determining intelligence has become a central issue. Psychologists like Raymond Cattell and Hans Eysenck defended the hereditary viewpoint, while others argued that intelligence is affected by the environment. Furthermore, the means used to test it were not culturally neutral and therefore generated distorted results. At the beginning of the 20th century, the British psychologist Charles Spearman laid the foundation for a more objective and scientific study of intelligence, using statistical techniques to test and measure it, identifying a single factor, the famous G factor, relating it to all the mental abilities that form general intelligence. The hypothesis of a single measure for intelligence was questioned by J.P. Guilford, suggesting that intelligence was actually made up of diverse abilities, in other words, the famous multiple intelligences. This idea that in turn gave rise to Raymond Cattell's theory on the existence of fluid and crystallized intelligence, 2 degrees of reasoning and critical thinking. Other areas of differential psychology have been researching emotions and facial expressions in pioneering works, like those of Paul Weckman and Nielsen. Simpan psychological disorders, individual differences appear to be points on a spectrum and not divided and easily identifiable categories, thus revealing the complexity and diversity of human psychology. And from these conclusions of the psychologists we just mentioned, psychologists mainly from 1990 onwards reached a kind of consensus, as far as this can happen in psychology, which is difficult, that in fact there are 5 factors that determine personality, which are the big 5, but we can talk about the big 5 later if you're interested. And this is a brief history of this old new discipline. Subscribe here to the channel so you don't miss content like this that you will find around here. Share with your friends who have an interest in psychology. This was undoubtedly the video that took the most work to make. Truly folks, I hope you enjoyed it. Choose one of these 2 videos that will be appearing here on the end screen because they will add a lot for you. See you in the next video. Until then,